Here's the thing today. You have a decision that you have to make. A decision that nobody can make for you. Because I know some of you, you don't like decisions. You're like my wife when we go on a date. Where you want to eat, babe? I don't care. It's up to you. Come on, just tell me. And then I finally make a decision. And she's like, I wasn't thinking that. Let's pick something else. And I'm like, whoa, you said I could do it. And then she's like, I don't want to go there. And so some of you are kind of like that. And you feel like some of the decisions that you make and what you do, it's not that big of a deal. But today you have to understand, you have the possibility of making the greatest decision you have ever made in your entire life. And that decision is this: who is Jesus to you? See, you have to answer that question. Because if you watch TV, if you listen to the great theologian Oprah Winfrey, then you're going to be confused about what I'm talking about. Because what Oprah says is that she stands on her TV. She is searching, and she is trying to find out, and she is living a good moral life, and she is a good person. And what she has deducted in her own mind is that it doesn't matter the name that you put on your God. It doesn't matter what you say your God is. It doesn't matter if you believe Hinduism and you have thousands upon thousands of God. It doesn't matter if you worship Buddha. It doesn't matter if you worship Allah. That in the end, even if you worship Jesus, in the end, no matter the name you give him, there's just every road that leads to the same conclusion. And that's that if you live a good life and you're a good moral person and that you've done the best that you could possibly do and you have appeased the God that you have given that name to, then when your time comes, when death finally happens and you are faced with eternity, that if you've lived a good life, then you're going to spend your eternity in heaven. And that's what a lot of people believe, and that's what a lot of people want to believe, and that's what a lot of people try to believe. But I want to tell you that Oprah was really, really close in what she was saying. But even though she was close, she couldn't be more wrong. Because what you have to understand is that you picture a mountain. And picture climbing a mountain. And at the top of that mountain sits all the gods that you can picture. All the gods that you can give a name to. And they sit on top of that mountain and they look down at your life and they judge the life that you live. And at the end of your life, if you have done enough good, then you have climbed the mountain far enough and there's a mark on the mountain to where if you get to that spot, then you get to spend eternity in paradise, in heaven, rejoicing. But if you don't get to that mark, if life isn't as good as you thought, if you didn't do enough good deeds, if your good doesn't outweigh your bad, then what you're going to be faced with is an eternity in hell. But most people would say, if I don't do horrible things, and as I walk through life, and every good deed, you climb higher up that mountain, and every good deed, you take a step closer to that God, and every good deed makes you follow that God, and makes that God smile a little bigger. And hopefully at the end of your life, you have done enough. And He's going to look and He's going to say, come on in. But there's one problem with that. See, the God that I serve, He looks down from top and He says, there's no way that you will ever be able to satisfy me with the works that you perform here on this earth. There is no way that you are ever going to do enough in order to be able to get to heaven. There's no way that you're ever going to be able to do enough to make me happy with the life that you have lived. And so He says, so what I'm going to do is I'm not sending myself because that's an easier sacrifice. I'm going to send the greatest sacrifice I can possibly give. The greatest form of love that I can possibly show to you. I'm not sending myself, I'm sending my Son down to you to take the punishment and the penalty that you deserve so that you can now have access to me. And if you will only believe in my Son, and His name is Jesus, and what He has done on the cross, then and only then can you have access to eternity with God forever in heaven. See, Oprah wants you to believe, and so many others want you to believe, that all roads lead to the same end. But I'm here to tell you that Jesus is the only way to the Father. And today you have to make a decision. Are you going to choose to acknowledge who Jesus is, or are you going to deny it? And you're going to live the life that you want to live. See, and some of you are sitting here and you're saying, but I don't understand. Let me put it in the simplest form that I know how. I love shopping. It's as simple as I can put it. I love shopping. The other day, Heather and I are fixing to go to the beach. And as we make our way to the beach, I'm looking for a bathing suit. And I've seen some online. They're called chubby. And I think it's to make fun of heavy people like me. And so they're shorter shorts. And I feel like with the legs that I've got, I need that bathing suit. And so I was telling Heather, I was like, I need a shorter bathing suit. Like, my legs look really good. And she's just like, babe, you are not built for a small bathing suit. And I'm like, I don't know what that means, but it hurts a little bit. And so I've only seen it online, but I was like, I'm not going to buy it. I want to try them on and just see if it looks as good in the mirror as it does in my mind. Because in my mind, like, I think I might become a model. And so I found a store here in town that had them. And I was like, yes, let's go. I want to go try it on. And she's like, why? Please, no. Don't get those. And I'm like, you're being rude. And so we went to the store. They had multiple colors. It was so awesome. We walk in, and it's just, the wall is filled with different colors. And I'm like, yes, this is a gift from God. Like, I knew. Like, He wanted me to have this swimsuit, obviously, because He put them right there. And so I start grabbing them, and I'm going to the dressing room, and I find the first one, and I put it on. And immediately when I put it on, I realized that my wife was right. And this body was not built for that bathing suit. And I leave all of them in there, and I walk out, and she can tell I'm disappointed. And she was walking around the store, and she sees me, and she's like, hey, where's the bathing suits? They didn't work. How come? They just didn't. And she goes, oh, did the chubbies make you chubby? I was like, thanks, babe. But I love shopping. And here's the thing. We'll take my kids now. I have 4 kids. And we will take my kids shopping now. The problem that my kids have is they don't do the most important thing, which is look at the price tag. See, what they do when they walk into the store, somehow they have this radar on them. That it doesn't matter if we're looking for clothes, if we're looking for shoes, or if we're looking for toys. It does not matter. They will walk in and find the absolute most expensive thing without even looking at the price tag and want that desperately. And they will realize that if they don't get that, their life is over and it will end. That they have to have that. Please, Dad, can I just have this? Please, I've got to have it. It's the greatest thing ever. But here's the problem. I know the cost of what they're asking for. And I've got to determine, is what they're asking for worth the price that is on the price tag? Is it worth it for me to spend that kind of money for my kids? For me to spend that kind of money in order for them to have what they want? See, today you have to understand that your sin, what separates you from God, has a price tag. And see, some of you feel like the price should be different on sin. Well, I'm not a murderer. I'm not a mass murderer. I'm not a serial killer. I've never done horrible things. I'm not a terrible parent. I don't do terrible things to my kids. I'm not a terrible person. Like, maybe I lie. Maybe I've cheated a little bit here and there and then. Maybe I say some words that I shouldn't say. Maybe I watch some things I should. But it's not that big of a deal. But what you have to understand is sin is like shooting an arrow and having a bullseye at the back of the room. And the bullseye is the target that Jesus has set up for your life. And it doesn't matter how far off you are from that bullseye. If you miss the bullseye, it is sin. And the price for that sin is death. See, you have to understand. It doesn't matter what you do. There's still a price tag attached to it. Now the question is, who's going to pay the price? See, who's paying for this? Who's paying for the lie that you've told? Who's paying for the theft that you've caused? Who's paying for the murder that you've committed? And you say, whoa, 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 I haven't committed murder. Well, Jesus says if you hate somebody in your heart, man, that's just like murder. Jesus says, you say, I haven't committed adultery. And Jesus says, whoa, whoa, whoa. If you even look on somebody with lust, then you've committed adultery. Like we sit here and we think we're really, really good. But now all of a sudden when we stand and we look at the bullseye in the back of the room that God has created for our lives, and we stand before God and we say, but God, I'm a pretty good person. I didn't do that bad of a thing. God looks and God says, okay, but you missed the target. You're a lying, thieving, murdering adulteress. And we've only gone through 4 of the 10 commandments. Do we really feel worthy in order to stand before God and say we're innocent? And so what we have to do is we have to look at the price tag that's attached to everything that we do. And then we have to ask the question, who's paying for it? Who's going to pay the price for your sin? See, what you have to understand is it doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. It doesn't matter when I walk into a store and I look at the price. It doesn't matter if I agree with it or not. I don't determine the price. The price has already been determined. See, you don't get to determine the price for your sin. It has already been determined. And the price for your sin is death. So now the question is, who's paying for it? Jesus, while he did his ministry here on earth, we find in Matthew chapter 27 and 28 is where we're going to be today. And I'm going to paraphrase. I'm just going to tell the story of what Jesus did. Jesus had been with his disciples. He had met with them in the other room, upper room, and then they went to the garden. And they were there in the garden, and Jesus was praying, and Jesus was asking his disciples to stay up, to pray with me, because the hour is coming, and we need to pray, because this is going to be the hardest thing that you and I have ever walked through. It's going to be the hardest thing that I have ever gone through up to this point, and I need your prayers. But the disciples kept falling asleep. But there was a man behind the scenes who was manipulating, who was moving, who was working, and his name was Caiaphas. And he was the high priest at the time. He was the religious person who was in charge at the time. And he hated Jesus from the moment that Jesus came on the scene. Because up to that point, everybody was looking to him. Everybody was getting guidance from him. Everybody was hearing what he had to say. And he was held in such high esteem. But Caiaphas, when Jesus came onto the scene, he began to hate Jesus for who he was and the message that he was proclaiming. Because Caiaphas had pride in his heart. And because of that pride, Caiaphas was unable to see Jesus for who he really was. Because Caiaphas desired the attention that Jesus was getting. See, it's the same thing that happened to Lucifer in heaven before he got cast out. See, Lucifer was an angel in heaven who was worshiping God and leading worship in heaven towards God. But as he was leading worship, he looked out and he said, I want what Jesus has. I want people to worship me the way that Jesus is being worshiped right now. And so he gathered up 1/3 of all of heaven to try and rebel against Jesus, to try and rebel against God. And God cast him out of heaven. And ever since then, he has been doing everything he can in order to deceive, manipulate, and turn people away from God. And Caiaphas was struggling with pride. And see, as we look at the cross, and as we look at the suffering that Jesus had to go through, it's easy to put on their murder. It's easy to put on their rape. It's easy to put on their other sins that we feel like are the big sins. But when we begin to look at the cross and we begin to realize that pride carries the same price tag as any other sin, it makes the cross and what Jesus had to suffer and what Jesus had to go through a little more personal to us today. Makes it a little more real. Because as Caiaphas stood there and he struggled with this issue of pride, just like all of us do. How many of us don't look at our neighbors and go, I deserve what they have. I work hard like them. I'm better than they are. I should have got that raise. I should have been able to do that. I should have had that position. I should have had eyes on me. I should have. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of pride, is I. In the middle of pride is my struggle. Because I feel like, and what the world tells me, when you turn on the TV, when you watch commercials, you deserve, you should get, you should have a bigger house, a nicer car, more vacations, more vacation homes. And everything says, I. And this world has turned into, everything is about me and for me. Everything. It doesn't matter. Everything should be for me. If it doesn't make me happy, then we shouldn't do it. If it doesn't make me feel good, then we shouldn't do it anymore. If you don't agree with me, then you shouldn't talk. And all of a sudden it becomes about I. And Caiaphas struggled with pride. But not only Caiaphas. As you see, Jesus was in the garden, and as he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, one of his disciples, one of the 12, one of the ones that were close to him, came up, put his arms around Jesus and kissed him on the cheek. And he gave him a kiss. And immediately when he gave Jesus a kiss, they put handcuffs on him and they began to march him away. Because Judas struggled with greed. See, Judas lived his life for 3 years walking and talking and watching Jesus do everything that he had done. Judas watched him as he performed miracles. Judas watched him as he walked into a girl's home who was dead, and the father had sought Jesus out, and his friends had come and said, "Leave Jesus alone. She's already dead." And Judas is right there at the back watching as Jesus walks into the house. And everybody on the outside is crying, is weeping, is mourning. She's dead! And then all of a sudden, Judas sees this girl walking out of the house eating a sandwich. Who was dead is now alive because of what Jesus had done. And right before that, not only that, there had been a woman who had been struggling with a disease that could not find a cure anywhere. For 12 years, she had been struggling. 12 years she had been suffering. She had gone to every doctor. She had given everything she had. And finally she reached out, and just one touch from Jesus changed her life completely. And Judas watched it. He had a front row seat to everything that Jesus was doing. And Judas watched as he healed the lame, as he gave sight to the blind. But in the end, the religious leaders came up to Judas and said, "Would you sell out Jesus?" I can't talk and right. "Would you sell out Jesus?" And Judas says, "What's the price?" 30 pieces of silver. Absolutely. Because his greed was greater than who Jesus was. See, if we take that money today and we look and we see how much value is that actually? It's about $3,000. They came and they said, "Judas, you've followed this man for 3 years. You've sat in a room with him. You've had private conversations that are not recorded in Scripture. You've listened as he's poured his heart out. You've heard some of the greatest sermons ever preached by this man. You've watched as he's fed people from 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. You've watched all that. Will you sell him out?" Yes. And some of you look and you say, "I would never do that to Jesus." But my question is to you, aren't you selling him out every single day when you don't make him number one in your life? But you get up and you think that the paycheck that you get and the job that you're doing in order to get a bigger house, in order to get a bigger car, in order to go on better vacations and do all this stuff, is your purpose in life. When you miss your purpose and you miss who God created you to be, and greed begins to step in, and you start looking and you start saying, well, my neighbors just added on to their house, I better do that too. Babe, we don't have the money, but we got credit cards. Thank you. Let's rack some up. Need new cars. They got a new car. My car's getting old. Nothing wrong with it, but they got a nice one, so I got to beat them. They're going on vacation. I got to go on a better one. And we go to work every single day trying to accumulate more and more and more and more and more and more. It's greed. And greed sent Jesus to the cross. For $3,000, Judas sold him out. See, if we don't wake up in the morning and go, God, it's not the job, but it's the calling. And God, what you placed on my life every morning as I get up, God, it's not going and pushing paper. It's not going and moving a shovel. It's not going and driving something. It's not going and selling something. God, I have an opportunity to interact with people, to share your love and your message with people. That's why you have created me. You haven't created me for all this stuff. The enemy is trying to rob and to lie to me and to tell me this is what it's all about. But I'm here to tell you, listen, Jesus has a greater plan and a greater purpose for your life. And it has nothing to do with greed. It has everything to do with eternity. And you are put here on this earth to point as many people to Jesus as we possibly can. That's why we're here. And in that garden, as Judas kisses the cheek of Jesus, they handcuff him. They begin to take him away. And as they take him away, there's a crowd that begins to gather. And as they take a leash and they take a whip and they begin to whip Jesus, and they begin to rip off the skin that is attached to his body. And they begin to grab his beard and yank his beard out of his face. And as they continue to whip him, and the scene is so gruesome even for those that are doing it. As they whip him, it rips off flesh and flesh. And if they were to hit him one more time in the stomach, it would go so deep that it would rip open his stomach and all his insides would come out. And see, that's the suffering he went through for you and I. And there's a crowd that is standing there watching all this. And Pilate, one of the men who is in charge, stands in front of the crowd and says, what do you want me to do with this man? And the crowd begins to chant, crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him! And let his blood be on us and our children. See, they didn't realize the power of that statement. See, what they meant for evil, God was fixing to shed for good. See, the blood that they were saying, let be on our hands, is the forgiveness that God is extending to even those that were shouting, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. See, but what's interesting about this crowd is a week before, they were the exact same ones that were taking off their jackets and laying them on the road as Jesus came into the city. They were taking palm branches and they were waving them and laying them on the ground, and they were shouting, Hosanna! Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna! And now 1 week later, that same crowd is saying, crucify him! Crucify him! See, but it's not much different than us today. It's not much different than society today, because what do? We base truth on emotions. We base truth on emotions rather than facts. Well, I don't feel that way, so if I don't feel that way, it must not be true. Well, if I don't feel like that, then it must not. And so all of a sudden, the emotions of the crowd began to seep over into everybody's life, and they were driven by emotions rather than truth. And they were driven by what they felt like, well, we must be doing the right thing because all of the crowd is shouting this and doing this. And what we begin to do as Christians and what we begin to do as the church is we'll worship God inside these doors. But when we get out in the crowd that doesn't believe in who God is, then all of a sudden we begin to question what we believe. Well, is what I believe right? Because not everybody believes it. Well, if it was right, wouldn't everybody know? If it was right, wouldn't everybody believe? If it was right, wouldn't everybody know that Jesus is the Son of God? And we begin to question because of the crowd and the emotions that are attached to the feeling that they have in that moment. And the indifference is what sent Jesus to the cross, but also standing up in front of the crowd as they were shouting, "Crucify them," was Pilate. And Pilate was the man who was in charge at the time, and as they brought him before, he was going to make the ruling on the decision for Jesus. And as they brought him before, Pilate stood there and he said, "I don't see that this man deserves to be crucified. I don't see that he has done anything that reflects and represents a death that should be given." But what does he do? Out of fear for what the crowd would think, out of fear of standing alone, out of fear of standing up for what is right, he said, "But if this is what you want, I'll do it. If this is what you want, then it's on you, it's not on me." See, it's easy inside these walls to follow Jesus, to worship Jesus, to say, "We love you, Jesus." But when you walk outside these walls and you walk into the office and the people sitting around you begin to act, begin to say, begin to do things, it's a lot harder to stand alone for Jesus in an environment that does not match what you believe. Because a lot of times what we do is we'll come to church, "Yes, we love you, Jesus," and then we won't stand in front of the crowd. And Pilate, out of fear, sent Jesus to the cross. See, when we look at the cross, we think it's all these major sins that sent Jesus to the cross. But we see pride, we see greed, we see fear, we see indifference. But then the last one is this. There's another one. There was another disciple. Jesus, before he was taken away, he looked at Peter and he said, "Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter says, "There's no way, Lord, I'll deny you. Ever. I will never deny you. I am with you until the end." They handcuff Jesus. They take Jesus away. And Peter begins to move. And as he moves outside of his comfort zone, as he moves away from his friends and the disciples, and he's watching as they're beating Jesus. He's watching as they're yelling, "Crucify him!" He's watching as they're stripping him of his clothes and they're putting a crown of thorns on his head. They're ripping his beard out. They're placing this beautiful, beautiful coat on him that represents royalty. And they're mocking him and they're making fun of him. And he's sitting around a fire and his emotions are going crazy. Because he realizes, what can I do? I'm just one man. And a little girl looks and says, "Hey, don't you follow that Jesus? Aren't you one of his followers?" And Peter says, "No, not me. Not me. I'm not." A little while later, a man comes by. "Hey, I've seen you before. You're with him." "No, I'm not. What are you talking about? I don't have a clue who that is." About an hour later, "I know who you are. You're one of the disciples." And see, Peter in front of his friends not too long ago when the soldiers had approached and the disciples and Jesus were around, they came to take Jesus. Peter jumped in front of Jesus, grabbed a sword, and cut a soldier's ear off. Chopped it off. But then when he found himself alone, the decisions that he was making was completely different. See, his attitude, his language, his heart had changed. And he said, "I don't know who that bleeping guy is." And he denied him 3 times. See, and you say, I would never deny Jesus. See, your life is just as powerful as your words. Because when you say, "I love you. If your life doesn't match that, then your words become worthless. It's one thing to say something, it's another thing to live it out. And if you say in this room, I love you, Jesus, but then when you walk out of these walls, if your life does not match the words that you are speaking, then the words that you are speaking become worthless. And Peter's denial sent Jesus to the cross. And so they took Jesus, they beat him, his body was broken. His skin was ripped off to the point that his own mother could not even recognize him. Blood coming down as a crown of thorns crushed into his skull. As his beard is ripped out, as his skin is ripped off. And they take him to a hill called Golgotha. And on that hill, they lay a cross down and they begin to hammer in a nail for this arm and a nail for this arm and a nail through his feet. And they pick that cross up and they shove it into the hole. And it jerks down. And as Jesus is up on that cross, even to just get a breath was absolute torture. Because as he was up, his lungs did not allow for oxygen to come in. And so he would have to push up on the nails in his feet and in his hands just to... And then he would fall back down. And he would fight as hard as he could to hold his breath for as long as he could. But then knew he would have to suffer again. And he would have to... And then he would fall back down. And then he would hang on that tree. Not for the sins that he had committed. Not for what he had done. But for the price tag that you and I had given him. See, his death and his suffering was not something that he deserved and something that he brought on himself. His death and his suffering was brought on because he loves you. And Jesus willingly put himself in our place and took on our punishment so that we could have a relationship with his Father God in heaven. And on that cross, he pushes himself up. And he says, it is finished. And he sinks down and he takes his last breath. And there, he dies the death that you and I deserve. Because that price tag is not what we determine. It's the cost that God says we have to pay. And so God gave the greatest sacrifice that he could possibly give, his son, Jesus. And he gave it for you because of his great love for you. There has been no greater expression of love than for a man to lay down his life for you. The greatest expression of love that God could give you and God could show you is him giving his son, and his son freely laying down his life for you. There's no greater expression. And as he took his last breath, hell began to celebrate. The demons began to shout, we've done it! We've won! We've beat him! Jesus is dead! And for 3 days, they have the greatest party that they could possibly have. And while they're celebrating, Peter, his closest friend, is mourning and filled with such regret. Because sin will always leave regret. No matter what it is, no matter what you do. Sin always leaves a bad taste of regret in your mouth. And Peter, knowing that the last words that he ever spoke were, I don't know you, as he caught the eyes of Jesus. And as Jesus is taken away and hung on the cross. And more than anything, Peter wishes, I wish I could just say I'm sorry. I wish I could have stood up for him. I wish I would have done something different. I wish I would have made a better decision. But the death that Jesus was dying, Peter didn't even understand, was for that moment. And in spite of Peter's rejection, Jesus still extended love. Jesus still extended forgiveness. Jesus still extended grace and mercy in spite of the response that Peter was giving in that moment. And as hell celebrates and the demons shout, all of a sudden something begins to happen. All of a sudden, there was a sound that shook heaven, that shook the earth. As the enemy was shouting, life was beginning to come to the body of Jesus. He kicks down the tomb. He walks out and he takes his place at the right hand of the Father, defeating death, defeating sin, giving you and I an opportunity to have a relationship with Him today. Listen, Jesus went through all of that because of His extreme love for you. Jesus went through all that because He didn't want you to pay this price. He didn't want you to have to pay a price that you could not pay. He went through all of that because He loves you. And so my question for you today is this: who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Is He a good man? Is it a good story? Or is He Savior? And is He King? Is He Lord of your life? See, because once we recognize that it's my sin that put Him on that cross, once we recognize that I'm the one that sent Him to that cross, and that His death has now paid for my sin. And when the Father looks at you and I, we are now acceptable, not because of what we have done, but we're acceptable because of what Jesus Christ has done on the cross. His death, His blood covers our sin and makes us acceptable before God. And His resurrection now gives us the opportunity that doesn't just cover sins of the past, but now it is forgiven and covered for all the sins of the future. And so because of Jesus' great love for us, you get to make a decision today. Who is Jesus?